I will never be forgotten." The words echoed in Evelyn's mind as she stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, the glittering chandeliers above her casting a cold, unfeeling light over the room. She had always been an afterthought, always a shadow in the corner of the grand halls of Ashford Manor, surrounded by polished nobles and their perfectly arranged smiles. Tonight, she was no different. Her gown, simple but elegant, clung to her slender frame, and though it was crafted by the finest hands, it paled in comparison to the extravagant silks of the others. The women standing around her were poised, their laughter light, their eyes glistening with false charm. They were the ones who had been groomed for this moment, but Evelyn had never been one of them. She had never been enough. She was the quiet cousin, the unnoticed one, the one who stood in the background and watched as others took the spotlight. As the Duke entered the ballroom, the air seemed to freeze. He moved like a shadow, his eyes scanning the crowd with a sharpness that made every other gaze feel irrelevant. His presence was undeniable, his power tangible. The room stilled, all conversation halting at once, leaving only the distant sound of the orchestra's strings. His black coat, perfectly tailored, shimmered as he walked, and the subtle click of his boots on the marble floor echoed like a slow drumbeat of a coming storm. He did not look at her. Of course, he didn't. She wasn't part of his world. Not really. But she couldn't help herself. She watched him as he moved, his every step deliberate, as though he knew every eye was on him, and he wanted them to be. His gaze passed over the first woman, then the second, without a second glance, then a third and fourth, as though they were nothing but fleeting shadows. The tension in the room grew, thick and suffocating. The Duke was choosing, but it wasn't her. It was never going to be her. She could feel it, the bitter sting of her place in this world. She was a part of it only by proximity, never truly invited to its glittering halls. The whispers around her were a chorus of dissatisfaction. "She's nothing," one woman murmured, not even trying to keep her voice down. Evelyn didn't flinch. She had heard worse, much worse, but this time it felt different. This time, she didn't just want to disappear. The Duke stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn's heart raced, a sudden, inexplicable fear clutching at her chest. He wasn't looking at the next woman. He was looking at her. His gaze, cold and penetrating, pierced through the crowd, through the fabric of her carefully constructed world, and directly into her eyes. Time slowed. Her breath hitched. The whispers around her died. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. The world seemed frozen in that one instant, as though everything was on hold. The Duke's eyes remained fixed on hers, and Evelyn could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to matter. She wasn't supposed to be seen. But in that instant, the impossible became reality. The Duke moved. His strides were purposeful, confident, and as he approached her, Evelyn could hear the quickening of her pulse in her ears. She felt the eyes of the room on her, burning into her skin. Her legs wavered slightly, but she held her ground. He was stopping in front of her now, and her breath came in shallow gasps. His hand reached out to her, and she had no choice but to take it. "Miss Sinclair," his voice was smooth, low, commanding, and it sent a chill through her spine. His fingers curled around hers, and she could feel the power in his grip. "You're the one I choose." The words echoed in her mind as everything else in the room faded away. There was no applause, no gasps of approval, just silence. The room was suspended in shock. Evelyn was no longer invisible. She was no longer overlooked. The Duke had chosen her, and in that single moment, everything changed. The eyes of the room turned to her, but they were no longer the indifferent gazes of strangers. They were filled with curiosity, envy, and disbelief. The shift had happened. She was no longer the forgotten cousin. She was the one who had been chosen. She could feel the tension building, the electricity crackling in the air between them, as if the very atmosphere had changed. The Duke's grip tightened, but he said nothing more, his expression unreadable. His cold, calculating eyes studied her face for any sign of resistance, but she remained silent. The whispers started again, but this time, they were different. This time, they were filled with confusion and wonder. The women who had once looked at her with disdain were now the ones who watched as she stood at the center of the room, chosen by the Duke. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer overlooked. The Duke had seen her, and that was all that mattered. The power had shifted. The ball was in her court now. The Duke's grip on Evelyn's hand tightened ever so slightly, as though testing her resolve. The weight of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine, but she didn't dare look away. She was now at the center of a storm, and the Duke was the eye of it. The room seemed to close in on them, the whispers of the nobles around her blending into a dull hum, like the buzz of a distant, unimportant conversation. Nothing mattered but him, the powerful Duke who had chosen her. For the first time in her life, Evelyn felt seen, not as the invisible woman she had been for so long, but as the object of his undivided attention. His voice, when he spoke again, was cold, almost clinical, but there was something about it that made her heart race. "You may accompany me," he said, his words clipped and commanding. Without waiting for a response, he led her away from the throngs of people, his hand still wrapped firmly around hers. The movement was swift, calculated. He did not stumble, and neither did she. It was as if they were in sync, a strange, unspoken bond that neither of them had yet fully realized. As they moved through the ballroom, all eyes were on them, the weight of the room's attention pressing down on Evelyn's shoulders. She felt the eyes of the other women, sharp and filled with disbelief. They were no longer the ones who had been chosen. They were the ones left behind, their future uncertain. She was the one now. But even as she felt the rush of power that came with being noticed by the Duke, there was a flutter of unease deep in her chest. The Duke's presence, his coldness, left no room for weakness. He was a man who took what he wanted, and Evelyn could not help but wonder if she was merely another possession to be claimed. They reached the far side of the room, the music growing quieter as they passed into the more secluded corner of the ballroom. The Duke stopped and turned to face her, his eyes still fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Evelyn swallowed, her mind racing. What did it mean? To be chosen by him, to be at the center of this game of power and prestige? She had spent her life on the fringes, but now she was thrust into the very heart of it. "Yes," she whispered, the word tasting unfamiliar on her tongue. The Duke gave a slight nod, though his expression remained unreadable. "You are not to speak of this to anyone," he continued, his gaze narrowing. "Your place here has only just begun." Evelyn could feel the weight of his words. She was no longer a mere guest at the ball. She was part of something much larger, something she did not fully understand yet, but something that would change her life forever. She could feel the tension rising between them, like an invisible cord pulling taut, ready to snap. But before she could speak, the Duke's fingers brushed against her cheek, a subtle, almost imperceptible touch. It was brief, but it sent a jolt through her. She had been touched by men before, but never like this. His touch was deliberate, cold, as if he were marking her, claiming her without a word. The room was silent now, the whispers gone, replaced by the oppressive quiet of uncertainty. Evelyn's mind spun as she looked into his eyes, searching for some hint of what he wanted from her. She had never been the center of attention before. She had never been desired like this. But now, with the Duke standing so close, so powerful, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of both fear and anticipation. He was a man who ruled with an iron fist, and she was a woman who had always been overlooked. But now, in this moment, she could feel the shift. She was no longer invisible. The power had shifted, and Evelyn had no idea what would come next. But the Duke did. His lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Stay close," he murmured, the command slipping from his mouth as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. The Duke had spoken, and she was bound by his words, her life now tangled in the web of his power. But even as the world around her seemed to blur, as the tension built to a fever pitch, one thought remained clear in her mind. She had been chosen. And now, she would have to learn what it meant to live under his watchful gaze. The ballroom was thick with an invisible tension, like the calm before a storm. Evelyn stood beside the Duke, her pulse quickening with each passing second. The air felt heavier now, the weight of the room's gaze pressing down on her like a tangible force. The music had shifted, the soft notes of the orchestra now sounding distant and muted as the attention in the room centered solely on them. The Duke's hand still rested firmly at the small of her back, a gesture that was at once commanding and unnervingly intimate. His touch was steady, unwavering, and Evelyn could feel the power he exuded in every inch of his presence. His grip on her was not possessive, yet there was an undeniable authority in it, one that sent a ripple of electricity through her body. He led her through the crowd with ease, parting the sea of people like they were nothing more than obstacles in his path. Every step they took was deliberate, measured, as though they were walking in perfect synchrony, but Evelyn's mind was anything but calm. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of it almost deafening in her ears. He had chosen her. She had never imagined she would be the one standing at the center of this world. The whispers around her seemed to blur together, but Evelyn's focus was on the Duke. He moved with purpose, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. His cold eyes never left her, and for a moment, Evelyn felt as if she were the only person in the world. They reached the farthest corner of the ballroom, the noise of the crowd fading into a muffled hum behind them. The Duke stopped, his hand moving from her back to lightly grasp her arm, guiding her to face him. The sudden proximity made her breath catch in her throat. She was so close to him now that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, could see the faintest lines of tension around his jaw. The Duke did not speak at first. His eyes searched hers, studying her with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Evelyn could not tear her gaze away. It was as if he were reading her, seeing into the deepest parts of her, places she had long kept hidden. "Do you understand what this means?" The Duke's voice was low, almost a whisper, yet it felt like a command. His words were simple, but the weight of them hung in the air between them like a thick fog. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had no words. She didn't know how to answer him. What did it mean? To be chosen by him? To stand here, in the middle of a ballroom full of nobility, knowing she was the object of the Duke's interest? His hand tightened slightly around her arm, his thumb brushing the fabric of her dress in a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. The room seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the tension in the air, could feel the eyes of the other guests burning into her, the weight of their gaze as heavy as the Duke's presence beside her. And then, without warning, he stepped closer, his face inches from hers. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening at the sudden proximity. His eyes flickered down to her lips for a moment before returning to her eyes, his expression unreadable. The room around them seemed to fade, the voices and sounds of the party fading into nothing. All that remained was the Duke and the heat that now seemed to envelop her. His hand shifted from her arm, tracing a line along her shoulder, the touch light, but sending a shiver of anticipation through her. Evelyn's mind spun. She didn't know what he wanted from her. She didn't know what to do. The Duke was a man of few words, a man who commanded attention without effort. In his eyes, something she had not expected. "You will learn your place here," he said finally, his voice still steady. But there was a hint of something else, something deeper, something that made Evelyn's pulse race. His words were final, and yet they felt like an invitation, an unspoken promise of what was to come. She wanted to ask him what that meant, wanted to know what he expected from her, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. Not here. Not now. The tension between them crackled in the air, and Evelyn felt her body responding to the Duke's presence in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't just his power, his cold authority, it was something else. Something she had never felt before. She had been overlooked for so long, never the center of attention, never the one who was desired. But now, in the Duke's presence, everything had changed. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the girl who stood in the shadows, forgotten and unimportant. She was the one he had chosen, and she could feel the weight of that choice pressing down on her, filling her with both fear and anticipation. The Duke stepped back, breaking the tension between them just as it seemed to reach its peak. He turned slightly, as though to survey the room once more, his hand still resting on the small of her back. Evelyn's heart was still pounding in her chest, but she managed to steady her breathing. She had been chosen, but what did that mean for her? What was the Duke's true purpose in selecting her? She had no answers, but the question burned in her mind, just as the Duke's presence burned in her chest. He had chosen her, and now she had to learn what that choice would cost. The room was alive with the buzz of conversation, but it felt distant to Evelyn. She stood at the Duke's side, her heart still racing from the weight of his gaze, the overwhelming sensation that her entire life had just been irrevocably altered. The grand ballroom of Ashford Manor, usually a place where she had been content to blend into the background, now seemed to close in around her. She was the center of it all, but for the first time, she was aware of the weight that came with that position. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room upon her. There was a coldness in the air, and it wasn't just from the Duke's presence. It was the weight of judgment, the scrutiny that she now felt as though it were a physical force pressing down on her. The whispers had already begun, barely masked by the polite murmurs of the other guests. "What is she doing here?" someone muttered. "She's nothing more than a distant relative, not even a true match for the Duke." Another voice whispered, sharp with disdain. Evelyn didn't have to look to know they were talking about her. She had spent her entire life standing on the sidelines, observing the whispers, the glances, the cruel words of a world that had never seen her as more than an afterthought. But now, the Duke had chosen her, and in doing so, he had placed her at the center of their judgment. She could feel the heavy gaze of Lady Helena, her aunt, drilling into her from across the room. The older woman's eyes were filled with disbelief, disappointment. Evelyn could practically hear her thoughts. How dare the Duke choose someone like her? She was the forgotten one, the one who had never been meant for this world of power and prestige. And yet here she was. The Duke had chosen her. The weight of his hand on her back felt heavier now. She could feel the tension building between them, thick like the storm clouds gathering in the sky. His presence was overwhelming, his power undeniable. He was the Duke of Ashford, the most influential man in the room, and everyone knew it. They had all felt it when he entered, the subtle shift in the air, the way the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. And now, he had chosen her. Evelyn's thoughts were interrupted as the Duke turned to her, his hand still at the small of her back, urging her to follow him through the room. They moved together, and the crowd parted before them as though they were the ones who commanded the space. Evelyn could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she refused to look away. She refused to show any sign of weakness. The Duke's gaze never wavered from her, his attention sharp and unwavering. She could feel the power dynamic shifting between them, the invisible thread that connected them tightening with every step they took. He was in control, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her wonder if perhaps he wasn't the only one with control in this situation. They reached the center of the ballroom, the eyes of every person in the room upon them, and the Duke stopped. For a moment, everything around them seemed to freeze, as if the world itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Evelyn stood still, her breath held, waiting for the Duke to make his next move. His gaze flicked briefly to the other women, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. They had all been contenders for his attention, but in the end, it had been her, Evelyn Sinclair, the one he had chosen. And in that moment, everything shifted. The Duke stepped closer, his presence closing the distance between them, and his hand moved to gently tilt her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. The coldness in his eyes was still there, but there was something else now, something that Evelyn couldn't quite place. "Do you understand what this means?" His voice was low, his words carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air between them. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She wanted to respond, to tell him that she understood, but the words felt like they were caught in her throat. What did it mean to be chosen by him? To stand in front of the world, to be under the scrutiny of everyone in this room, all of them wondering why he had chosen her and not one of them? She could feel the tension in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken words. The crowd was silent now, their collective gaze fixed on them as if waiting for some grand revelation. "You are not like them," the Duke continued, his fingers still resting lightly on her chin. His words were a statement, not a question. "You have no place in their world, but you will learn to move in mine." The words sent a jolt through Evelyn, a mix of fear and anticipation racing through her veins. She had always been on the outside, always been the one overlooked, the one ignored. But now, here she was, standing at the center of the room, chosen by the Duke of Ashford himself. The power dynamics between them were clear. He was the one in control, looked at her as if she were an imposter, a fraud in their world of perfection. And yet, here she was, chosen by the Duke, the very man who had always been a symbol of everything she had been denied. But the Duke did not seem to care about their judgment. His attention was on her, and only her. He stopped near the center of the room, his hand still on her back, urging her to remain close. His touch was not gentle. It was commanding, possessive, as though he were marking her as his own. Evelyn stood before him, heart racing, breath shallow. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she dared not look away from the Duke. She could feel his power radiating through the space between them, a palpable force that threatened to swallow her whole. He looked at her with those cold, calculating eyes, the intensity in his gaze making her stomach churn. The tension in the room was thick, like the heavy weight of an impending storm. Evelyn could hear the murmurs from the surrounding guests, the confusion, the disbelief. They were all wondering the same thing. Why her? Why had the Duke chosen her? She was no longer the girl they all knew, the one who had always been in the background. She was now the Duke's chosen, and that position came with consequences. The Duke stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. His presence towered over her, making her feel small, fragile. "You will learn to move in my world," he said, his voice low, controlled, like a warning. Evelyn's pulse quickened at his words. What did that mean? What kind of world was he asking her to step into? A world where she was no longer invisible? A world where she was forced to play a role she wasn't sure she could handle? The Duke's fingers lightly brushed her arm, sending a jolt of electricity through her. The simple touch felt like a command. It felt like a promise, and it terrified her. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He could see the fear that threatened to rise within her, and yet, he did nothing to calm her. Instead, he held her there, locked in place by his unwavering gaze. The Duke was a man who didn't need to explain himself. His silence spoke louder than any words could. His power was enough. "You will be mine," he said, his voice like velvet, but edged with the steel of authority. The words sank into Evelyn's chest like a weight she couldn't escape. She could feel the change in the air around them, the shift in the room as the guests watched them, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The power had shifted, and Evelyn was no longer the girl who had been overlooked. She was now the Duke's. But as the Duke stood before her, she realized that his control was not just about power. It was about submission, about bending others to his will. She had been chosen, but she didn't know if that was a blessing or a curse. "You will stay close to me," the Duke murmured, his hand on her arm once more, guiding her forward as if she were a prized possession. Evelyn's heart raced as they moved through the ballroom once again, the whispers and stares following them like shadows. She was no longer just a spectator in this world. She was now a part of it, and everything she had known before was slipping away with every step she took beside the Duke. The air grew colder as they moved through the crowd, the power dynamic between them clearer than ever. She could feel the weight of his expectations on her, the pressure to live up to the role he had placed her in. But what did it mean to be chosen by him? What did it mean to be the one he had selected, to be at the center of this world of power and privilege? She had no answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner of the room. She had been seen, and now, she would have to face the consequences of being chosen. The ballroom felt like a different world now, a place where every breath, every movement was magnified under the Duke's gaze. Evelyn's heart raced, a constant reminder of the tension hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. The Duke, his hand resting lightly at her back, continued to guide her through the sea of people. But now, as they walked, the whispers grew louder, the weight of the judgment in the air almost tangible. "What is he thinking?" one voice murmured, sharp with disbelief. "She's nothing like the others," another hissed, the scorn clear in their tone. Evelyn could feel the weight of every eye on her, burning into her skin. She had been chosen, but now it felt like a curse. She wasn't just the outsider anymore. She was the focal point of the room's contempt, the object of their curiosity and disdain. The Duke's presence was a shield, his power surrounding them like an invisible wall, but Evelyn couldn't help the tightening in her chest. She was now a part of his world, and the weight of it felt heavier with every passing moment. His steps were steady, his posture unflinching, as though nothing could shake him. His gaze remained cold, focused, but Evelyn could feel the subtle pressure in the way he held her, his hand on her back, never too forceful, but always present, always guiding. There was no room for hesitation in his world, no space for uncertainty. He moved with the certainty of someone who had always known what he wanted. And in that moment, Evelyn realized she was no different from the rest of the women he had passed over. She was just another piece in his grand design. But that realization was followed by a flicker of something else, a strange mix of defiance and fear. She was not the one to be ignored anymore. She had been seen, and in his eyes, she was now something to be claimed. As they moved through the room, the tension between them thickened, palpable, like an electric charge that neither of them could escape. The Duke's hand never left her back, his fingers barely grazing her skin, but each touch sent a jolt through her, making her aware of every inch of their proximity. He wasn't touching her the way a man touches a woman he cares for. His hand was an anchor, a reminder of who held the power between them. They stopped near the center of the ballroom, the crowd parting before them like water flowing around a stone. Evelyn could hear her breath, shallow, rapid, as she stood there, caught in the storm that had erupted the moment the Duke had chosen her. The room was silent now, every guest's eyes fixed on them, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next move. The Duke did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, his gaze never leaving Evelyn's face, his expression unreadable. Evelyn could feel the weight of his stare, as though he were searching for something in her, something he had yet to find. His gaze moved over her face, lingering on her eyes, her lips, as if assessing her, as if deciding what to do next. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, and Evelyn felt herself beginning to crack under its pressure. The Duke finally spoke, his voice low, but carrying enough authority to make every word feel like a command. "You are not like them," he said, his tone steady, unwavering. "You are not meant for their world, but you will learn to move in mine." Evelyn's chest tightened at his words. What did that mean? What kind of world was he asking her to step into? He was a man who commanded everything and everyone around him with nothing more than his presence, his words. And she had always been overlooked, dismissed, a mere shadow in a world she could never truly belong to. Now, she had no choice but to learn, to adapt, to survive in a world that was not made for her. "You will learn your place," the Duke continued, his hand moving slightly, as though to reinforce his words. The motion was subtle, but Evelyn could feel the weight of it in her chest. She was not to question him. She was not to challenge him. She was to accept it. She was to accept him. The pressure between them grew, the power dynamic so clear, so undeniable. The room, the whispers, the judgment, they all seemed to fade as Evelyn was consumed by the Duke's presence. His hand on her back, his gaze on her, his words, they all carried the weight of his control. And Evelyn realized, with a jolt, that she was no longer the woman she had been. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the woman who stood in the shadows. She was now the woman who stood in the center of the Duke's world. But what did that mean for her? What kind of world had she stepped into? The Duke's gaze softened slightly, but the power remained, unwavering. "You will learn," he repeated, the words both a command and a promise. Evelyn felt the air shift between them, the unspoken tension thick in the space. They shared. She wasn't sure what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was certain. Her life, as she knew it, was gone. She was now part of something much larger. And as she stood there, in the Duke's world, she could feel the weight of what she had just stepped into pressing down on her. She was chosen, but at what cost? The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted once again, as the Duke's presence grew even more imposing. Evelyn's breath was shallow, her heartbeat like a drumbeat in her chest. Every inch of her body was alert, every sense heightened as the weight of the room's gaze pressed down on her like 1,000 invisible hands. She had been chosen, yes, but in that moment, the reality of it was sinking in like a stone into still water. She was no longer a shadow in the corner. She was at the center of everything. She felt the eyes of every person on her. Those who had once seen her as nothing more than a forgotten relative now watched her like she was an anomaly. And it wasn't just the people who looked at her with disdain. No, it was the way the Duke stood beside her, his hand on her back, his touch never soft, but commanding. He moved with the quiet authority that only someone like him could, as though the world bent to his will. And it did. She could see the others, those once so proud, so poised, now watching her with a mix of disbelief and jealousy. Evelyn had always been the one to observe from the fringes, but now she was thrust into the heart of a game she never wanted to play. And yet, here she was, holding her ground. The tension between her and the Duke was palpable, an invisible current that threatened to pull her under at any moment. His eyes, cold and sharp, never left her face as they moved through the crowd. Every step they took together, every movement they made, felt like a declaration. He was the one who controlled the space, who moved the room. And she was there, tethered to him, with no way to escape. Her heart pounded faster with each passing second. The whispers from the surrounding guests grew louder, the sound of their judgment cutting through the tension in the air. "She's not fit for this," one voice hissed, barely audible above the hum of the crowd. "She doesn't belong here." Another whispered with contempt, "She'll never last." Evelyn didn't flinch. She had heard worse, much worse, and still, she could feel their disdain like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. They thought she didn't belong. They thought she was nothing. But she had been chosen. And that choice, as overwhelming as it was, meant something. The Duke's hand shifted from her back to her elbow, gently guiding her to the center of the ballroom. The power dynamic between them was clear now. His hand, his touch, his every move spoke of control. She was to follow him. To be seen, but never to question. To be at his side, but always in his shadow. They stopped at the heart of the room, surrounded by the aristocracy, the highest of society. The Duke turned to face her, his eyes locked on hers with that same cold, unwavering gaze. For a moment, Evelyn felt like she was drowning in it, caught in the intensity of his stare. His hand, still holding her elbow, tightened slightly, and she could feel the heat of his touch through the fabric of her gown. She could feel the tension in the air building once again, like the calm before a storm. And then, without warning, the Duke spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something behind it, something that made Evelyn's chest tighten. "You will learn to move in this world," he said, each word deliberate, cutting through the silence like a blade. Evelyn swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had no choice but to nod. What else could she do? She had been chosen, but what did that truly mean? To live in the Duke's world was to live under his command, to be seen as an object of his will, to be a part of his plans. But what would happen to her once she stepped into that world completely? What was she to him, really? His pawn? His prize? His possession? Her chest tightened at the thought. The Duke's gaze softened slightly, but the command in his eyes remained. "Do not think you can hide, Evelyn," he said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "You are in this now. You have been chosen." She could feel the weight of his words, the finality of them. He was not asking for her opinion. He was not offering her a choice. He was telling her what she was. She was his. And in that moment, Evelyn realized that there was no turning back, no escaping this world. She was trapped in it, whether she wanted to be or not. The Duke turned away, his hand still guiding her through the sea of people. They moved together, and once again, the crowd parted before them, the nobles standing still, watching them with a mix of fascination and awe. Evelyn could feel the cold stares of the other women, the envy in their eyes as they watched her walk beside the Duke. She was no longer one of them. She was now something else, something new. The Duke's hand remained on her arm, a constant reminder of his power over her. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape him. And as they made their way through the ballroom, the weight of the moment settled over her, heavy and suffocating. This was it, the moment of change, the moment when everything she had known slipped away, replaced by a future she didn't understand. But one thing was certain, she had been chosen, and that would change everything. The air in the ballroom was electric with tension, the whispers of the guests barely audible against the heavy silence that hung between Evelyn and the Duke. Every step they took was magnified, every movement, every breath a reminder of the power dynamic that had shifted in the blink of an eye. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, cold and calculating, like 1,000 invisible hands pressing down on her shoulders. The Duke moved effortlessly through the room, his hand still resting at her back, guiding her with a quiet authority that made it impossible to look away from him. She had been chosen, yes, but it was clear now that the consequences of that choice were far more complex than she had imagined. The crowd parted before them like a wave before a stone, their eyes following every movement, every gesture. Evelyn could feel the stares of the other women burning into her skin, their jealousy and contempt palpable. They had been in her place before, had stood in the center of this world, basking in the attention of the Duke, the admiration of the room. And now, it was her turn. But instead of feeling triumphant, she felt a sense of unease creeping in. The power shift between her and the Duke was undeniable, but there was something cold in the way he held her, something calculating in his every move. He wasn't holding her like a man in love. He was holding her like a man who had claimed his prize. The tension between them was almost unbearable. As they moved through the ballroom, the space around them seemed to shrink, the eyes of the guests narrowing as they observed the unspoken battle of wills that played out before them. Evelyn could feel her pulse quickening, her breath shallow, as though the very air she breathed was charged with electricity. The Duke's grip tightened on her back, a subtle but undeniable shift, a warning. She was his now, and there was no room for weakness. They reached the farthest corner of the ballroom, where the light from the chandeliers cast long, sharp shadows across the floor. The Duke stopped, turning to face her, his eyes never leaving hers. Evelyn could feel the heat of his gaze, like a flame licking at her skin. His presence was overwhelming, all-encompassing, and in that moment, she felt smaller than she ever had before. Do not mistake this for a mere gesture, Evelyn. The Duke's voice was low, his words cutting through the heavy silence. You are no longer the woman who stands in the shadows. You are the one I have chosen, and with that choice comes a responsibility you will learn to bear. His words sent a shiver through her, but she didn't speak. What could she say? The Duke's words were like chains, heavy and unyielding, binding her to a fate she hadn't chosen, a fate that was now beyond her control. She could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her, the unspoken demand for her to comply, to accept the role he had given her. There was no room for resistance, no space for rebellion. She had been chosen, and that was the end of it. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension between them palpable, like a drawn bowstring waiting to snap. The Duke's hand slid from her back to her waist, his fingers resting lightly against the fabric of her gown. The touch was not gentle. It was a reminder, a claim, and Evelyn's body responded to it in ways she could not ignore. Her heart raced, her chest tightening, as though her very soul was being drawn toward him, against her will. She had never been the one to stand out, to be seen. She had always been the observer, the one who stayed in the background, never drawing attention to herself. But now, everything had changed. She had been thrust into the center of this world, and there was no turning back. The Duke's eyes never left hers, his expression unreadable, but there was a shift in the air between them, a subtle change in the power dynamic that she could feel deep in her bones. She was no longer the overlooked relative. She was now the Duke's. And in that moment, Evelyn realized something terrifying. She was no longer just a part of this world. She was the center of it. The Duke's hand tightened on her waist, pulling her closer, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through her body. She could feel the heat of his presence, his body just inches from hers, the power in the air almost too much to bear. She wanted to pull away, wanted to escape the pressure building between them, but she didn't move. She couldn't. His grip on her was not just physical. It was something more, something far deeper. The Duke was a man who controlled everything in his world, and Evelyn was no exception. His hand on her waist was a reminder of that control, a reminder that she was now part of his plans, part of his world, whether she liked it or not. And yet, as the tension between them grew, as the world around them seemed to fade into the background, Evelyn felt a flicker of something else, something that went beyond the power, beyond the control. It was the realization that, for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't forgotten. She had been chosen. And with that choice came something more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. The Duke's eyes softened ever so slightly, but the power still lingered in the air between them. He had not spoken again, but the words were unnecessary. His presence spoke louder than anything else. She was his now, and there was no going back. As the silence stretched on, Evelyn realized that the tension would never be resolved, not yet. It would only continue to build, to escalate, until something finally broke. She wasn't sure what that something would be, but she knew one thing. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The tension in the room had reached its breaking point. Every gaze was fixed on Evelyn and the Duke, the weight of their silence heavier than any spoken word. She could feel the invisible threads of judgment, of power, tightening around her chest, suffocating her. The Duke's hand was still at her back, his touch light, but it carried an undeniable weight, a reminder that she was now bound to him in a way she had never anticipated. The air around them was thick, charged with an energy that pulsed between them, raw and unyielding. Evelyn's breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest as she stood, frozen in the center of the ballroom. The world around her seemed to disappear, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. All she could focus on was the Duke. His eyes, cold and piercing, never left her face. She could feel the power radiating from him, a force so strong it seemed to press against her skin. The room was silent now, every guest holding their breath, waiting for the next move. And yet, it was in this silence that the tension became unbearable. Evelyn's pulse quickened. What was happening? The Duke, for all his power, had chosen her, but the choice was no longer enough. She was not a prize to be claimed without consequence. She could feel the weight of every expectation placed on her, the pressure of every eye on her. The Duke had placed her at the center of his world, but now she was starting to wonder if she had truly understood what that meant. The power dynamic had shifted. The control he held over her, though palpable, was not the only force at play here. She, too, had a choice. And in that moment, something inside her stirred, a flicker of defiance, a realization that she had been living in the shadows for too long. The Duke's hand moved from her back to her arm, guiding her once again through the crowd. She could feel his fingers against her skin, strong and steady, like a constant reminder of the control he exerted over her. But as they moved, the crowd seemed to part before them, not with awe or admiration, but with suspicion, protest, to argue. But the words caught in her throat. She didn't know. She didn't understand. But the Duke did. And as he stood before her, his presence overpowering, she realized the truth. She had made a choice when she had allowed herself to be drawn into his world. The room seemed to close in around them as the Duke stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She had no escape now, no way out. She was part of his world, and there was no turning back. The Duke's eyes softened just slightly, a flicker of something almost unreadable in his expression. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "You will learn," he said softly, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. "You will learn what it means to be mine." The words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the power that had shifted, that had been placed in her hands. She wasn't just a part of this world, she was becoming it. And as the Duke's hand moved to rest gently at her back once more, Evelyn realized that she was no longer the woman she had been. She was no longer the girl who had been overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten. She was now the Duke's, and the world would never look at her the same way again. The tension between them remained, palpable and thick, as they stood in the heart of the ballroom, surrounded by the eyes of 100 onlookers. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. She had been chosen, yes, but it was the price of that choice that she was just beginning to realize. The ballroom was suffocating with tension. Evelyn's pulse raced as she stood beside the Duke, his presence overwhelming, suffocating the very air between them. The whispers had died down now, but the weight of every eye on her still pressed down like a physical force. The power dynamic between them had shifted, and the realization hit her with the force of a crashing wave. She was no longer just the chosen one. She was something more, something that the Duke had not only claimed but controlled. She had always been the invisible woman in the background, but now she was in the center of this world, a world that was as cold as. It was beautiful, and full of dangers she didn't fully understand. The Duke's hand still rested on her back, his touch light but unwavering, a constant reminder that she belonged to him now. He was the master of this world, the one who controlled everything, and she was merely a part of his grand design. The power he wielded was evident in every movement, every glance, and Evelyn could feel it like a weight in her chest. But it wasn't just his power that frightened her. It was the way she had come to realize just how much she had underestimated her own position. As they walked through the ballroom, their path cleared by the murmurs of the onlookers. Evelyn couldn't help but feel a shift within herself. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. She was no longer the passive observer. She was now the one with the power to change everything. The Duke's gaze never wavered as he led her through the crowd, but Evelyn could feel his control tightening around her, the tension between them becoming almost unbearable. The more she felt his presence, the more she wondered what it truly meant to be the Duke's chosen. What did he want from her? What did it mean for her to be by his side, to be part of his world? The more she thought about it, the more the weight of it became suffocating. The Duke was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority that no one dared to challenge. His power wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was in the way he held her, in the way the room shifted when he entered. He commanded respect, and everyone in this ballroom knew it. Evelyn, however, was beginning to see through the surface of that power. She was starting to realize that the Duke, for all his control, might be just as trapped in this world as she was. She had been chosen, yes, but not in the way she had first thought. This wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't about love or desire. This was about control, about power, about something darker than either of them had realized. As they reached the far side of the ballroom, the Duke turned to her, his eyes locked on hers. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick. With unspoken words, unacknowledged truths. The silence was suffocating, and Evelyn felt as though she couldn't breathe. The Duke's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes now, something that unsettled her, something that made her wonder just how much of this was truly in her control. "Do you feel it?" His voice was low, barely a whisper, but the words were sharp, cutting through the silence between them. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? "Feel what?" she whispered back, her voice barely audible. The Duke's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The weight of what you've chosen," he said, his words heavy with meaning. Evelyn's stomach dropped as she understood what he was saying. She had chosen to be a part of his world, yes, but she had not fully understood the consequences of that choice. The power, the control, the Duke had given her none of it. She was just another piece in his game, a piece that he had placed at his side, but she was still just a pawn in a world that belonged to him. The Duke took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as his hand reached for her, his fingers brushing against her wrist. The simple touch sent a shock through her, a surge of electricity that made her pulse race. "You belong to me now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Evelyn's knees feel weak. His words, so final, so certain, echoed in her mind like a warning. And then, the world seemed to freeze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, nothing but the two of them standing there, locked in this battle of wills. Evelyn's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She had been chosen, yes, but was that really a choice? Was she a part of this world, or was she simply being consumed by it? The Duke's grip on her wrist tightened ever so slightly, and she could feel the strength in his touch, the power in the way he held her. He was in control. She was not. But for the first time, Evelyn felt a shift inside herself. A quiet realization. She had been placed in this world, yes, but she had never truly been a part of it. The Duke had chosen her, but that choice came with a price. And now, as the tension between them reached its peak, Evelyn understood something that had eluded her until now. She wasn't just a pawn in the Duke's game. She was becoming a player, a part of something bigger. She didn't know how she would navigate this world, but she knew one thing. The power had shifted, and she was no longer invisible. The room was charged with tension, an invisible weight pressing down on Evelyn as she stood before the Duke. The air was thick, suffocating, as though every breath she took was laden with the consequences of her choices. The ballroom, once a place of distant luxury and opulence, had become a battlefield. The power had shifted, and Evelyn was now standing in the center of that shift, her heart racing, her pulse pounding. She could feel the Duke's presence like a constant pressure against her skin. His hand rested at her back, but it no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like a reminder of the power he held, of the control he exerted over everything in his world, including her. His eyes never left hers, his gaze cold, calculating, but there was something in them now, something darker, more dangerous, that she hadn't seen before. Do you understand now? The Duke's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of authority. His words cut through the silence between them, sharp and deliberate. Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. She had thought she understood. She had thought she had a grasp on what being chosen by him meant. But now, with the truth hanging in the air between them, she realized just how little she had known. She was no longer just a woman in his world. She was part of a game, his game, a game where the stakes were higher than anything she had ever imagined. And as the realization hit her, Evelyn felt the ground beneath her shift once again. She was no longer just playing along. She was a player in this game, with no way of stepping back. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but the question echoed through the space between them, charged with the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was about to unfold. The Duke's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no warmth in it. "This is the price of being chosen," he said, his tone cool, his words cutting through her like a blade. "You think you have power now? You think you can stand beside me and be part of my world?" He took a step closer, his presence looming over her, his hand sliding from her back to rest firmly on her wrist, his fingers tightening just enough to send a jolt of electricity through her. The touch was sharp, commanding, and Evelyn's heart raced as she stood there, caught in the intensity of the moment. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the tension building between them like a storm on the verge of breaking. His grip was strong, unyielding, but it wasn't just his touch that had her breath caught in her throat. It was the weight of his words. The Duke was not the man she had imagined him to be. He wasn't the man who had swept her off her feet, who had made her feel seen for the first time. He was a man who took control, who demanded submission, who played a game with no room for weakness. And Evelyn was just another piece on his board. Her chest tightened as the full force of that hit her. The power had shifted, yes, but the shift was not what she had thought. It wasn't just about being chosen. It was about being controlled. The Duke leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "You think you have a choice? You think you have power? You belong to me, Evelyn, and you will learn what that truly means." His words were a command, but they were also a warning. Evelyn's body trembled, not with fear, but with something else, a mix of defiance and realization. She had been chosen, yes, but she had not understood the consequences of that choice. She had thought she could walk beside him, stand by his side, and be part of his world. But now, she saw the truth. She was not his equal. She was his possession. She was a part of his game, and nothing more. The Duke's fingers tightened on her wrist, his grip forcing her to look at him, forcing her to acknowledge the reality of their situation. The room seemed to freeze, the world outside them ceasing to exist. There was only him, only the weight of his control, only the tension between them, thick and suffocating. And then, as if everything had built to this one moment, the Duke's lips brushed against her ear, his voice low and commanding. "You will never be the same again, Evelyn. This world will change you. And when it does, you will belong to me completely." The words hung in the air like a heavy, unspoken truth. Evelyn could feel the weight of them settling in her chest, pressing down on her heart. She had been chosen. But now, the price of that choice was becoming clear. The tension between them had reached its peak, the power dynamic clear and undeniable. She was no longer the forgotten woman in the corner. She was the Duke's. And with that came something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The Duke stepped back, his hand finally leaving her wrist, but the pressure didn't ease. His presence still loomed over her, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that was almost unbearable. She stood there, frozen in the moment, her body trembling with the realization of what she had just become a part of. The room around them seemed to breathe again, the silence broken by the murmur of the guests, but Evelyn couldn't move. She couldn't speak. All she could do was stand there, caught in the storm that had been set in motion the moment the Duke had chosen her. The power had shifted. The game had changed, and Evelyn had no choice but to play it out. The tension was unbearable, but she had no escape. She had been chosen, and now, she would face the consequences. The world she had stepped into would never let her go. And the Duke? He would never let her forget it. The moment hung in the air, suffocating with the weight of expectation. Evelyn stood before the Duke, the tension between them unbearable, the silence deafening. The ballroom around them had faded into the background, the whispers of the guests silenced by the force of the power that crackled between them. His eyes, cold and steady, never left hers, and for the first time, Evelyn felt the full force of what had been building between them. The choices made, the consequences unfolding. She had been chosen, but at what cost? The Duke's hand rested lightly on her arm, a subtle but firm reminder of his control, his dominance. His presence was overpowering, and Evelyn could feel the shift within herself, a realization that had been slowly creeping up on her. She was no longer the woman who had been ignored, the one who had faded into the background. She was now at the center of it all, a part of a world she had never understood until now. The Duke had chosen her, but she was beginning to understand that choice came with a heavy price. His power was absolute, and with that power came a control that left little room for rebellion. The room around them seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on the pair of them, waiting for something to break, for the tension to snap. Evelyn's pulse quickened as the Duke stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking with every passing second. His gaze softened for the briefest of moments, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable, something that made Evelyn's chest tighten. She had spent so long hiding in the shadows, unseen and unimportant, and now, standing before the Duke, she realized that this world had never been made for her. She had been a pawn in his game, and yet, she was beginning to understand that she held more power than she had ever thought possible. The Duke's grip tightened slightly, his hand pulling her closer, but it was not an act of affection. It was an assertion of control. "You will never be the same, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice a low, almost inaudible command. His words reverberated through her, sending a shiver down her spine. For a moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. She could feel the weight of his words, the truth of them sinking deep into her chest. She was no longer the woman who had been overlooked. She was no longer the woman who had been forgotten. She was the Duke's, and that was both terrifying and intoxicating. But as the Duke held her, his fingers pressing into her skin, Evelyn realized something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. She had the power to change this. She had the power to reshape her future, to shift the balance between them. The Duke's grip loosened, but only just, as though testing her. Evelyn's heart raced as she stepped back, out of his reach. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to send a ripple through the space between them. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath once more, the air thick with tension. The Duke's eyes flickered with something almost imperceptible, but there. A flicker of surprise? Of uncertainty? Evelyn didn't know, but it was there. And in that moment, she understood. She had been chosen, but she was not helpless. She was not powerless. The power dynamic between them had shifted again, and Evelyn could feel it in the air, a subtle but undeniable change. The Duke's expression remained calm, unreadable, but Evelyn could sense the shift in him, too. She had walked beside him, followed him, but now, she was standing on her own. She wasn't the girl who had been dismissed. She wasn't the girl who had been left behind. She was the woman who had stepped into the Duke's world, but now, she would no longer be merely a part of it. She would make her own place. "You think you can control me, don't you?" Evelyn's voice was steady, firm, the words slipping from her lips with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. The Duke's gaze flickered, a hint of something crossing his features, surprise, maybe, or something else, but he said nothing. His silence was all the answer she needed. She had the power now. The Duke had chosen her, yes, but it was she who would decide what came next. The world around them seemed to fade again, the ballroom, the guests, all of it slipping away. All that remained was the Duke, standing before her, his eyes locked on hers with that same cold intensity. Evelyn took a step closer, her breath steady, her heart calm. She could feel the power in the air between them, and it was no longer the Duke's alone. It was theirs. The tension between them had reached its peak, but now, it was different. The power shift had been completed. Evelyn was no longer a pawn. She was a player. And as she stood there, facing the Duke, she knew that everything had changed. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of their unspoken words, the unacknowledged truth hanging in the air like a fragile thread. But for the first time, Evelyn didn't feel small. She didn't feel helpless. She was standing on her own, and for the first time, she felt the power that came with it. The Duke may have chosen her, but now, it was she who would shape her destiny. The game had changed, and she was ready to play. The weight of the room had never felt so heavy, the silence so thick. Evelyn stood before the Duke, the power in the air between them now undeniable, an invisible current that pulled at her every fiber. The ballroom around them was a blur, whispers, murmurs, the sound of soft shoes against the polished floor. Everything faded into the background. All that mattered was the Duke and the world they now inhabited together. He had chosen her, yes, but in doing so, she had chosen him. She had stepped into a world where she was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. But what came with that choice was more than she could have ever anticipated. The Duke's presence loomed over her, but this time, it wasn't just about control. It was about understanding, about the subtle shift that had taken place within her. For the first time, she felt as though she was no longer a player in his game. She was the game itself. His hand reached out, fingers brushing lightly against her arm, a physical connection that sent a spark through her skin. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, but it was enough to make her heart race. She could feel the weight of his expectations, his power pressing down on her. But this time, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like an invitation. An invitation to claim her own space in this world, to carve out her place beside him, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. The room was still, the tension high. The Duke's eyes never left hers, his gaze intense, almost searching. "You are no longer the woman who stood in the shadows," he said, his voice low and steady, his words hanging in the air like a promise. Evelyn's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of his words, the truth of them sinking in. She had never been the center of attention, never been the one who was seen as anything more than a background figure in the world she had inhabited. But now, as she stood there, she realized something had changed. She was no longer invisible. She had been seen, truly seen, by the Duke. And in that moment, she understood what that meant. It meant power. It meant a world that no longer dismissed her, a world where she could stand at the center, not as an accessory to someone else's story, but as the story itself. The Duke's hand shifted from her arm, sliding up to her shoulder, his fingers pressing firmly against her skin. The touch was commanding, but it wasn't suffocating. It was a reminder of the connection that had been forged between them, a bond that had been built on more than just his power. It had been built on her own strength, on the realization that she could stand beside him, not behind him. For the first time, Evelyn felt the full extent of her own power, power she had never allowed herself to claim. The room seemed to hold its breath as the Duke stepped back, giving her space to process the weight of the moment. She stood still, her breath steadying, her mind racing. The tension between them had not eased, it had only intensified, but this time, it was different. The Duke's control was still there, but it was no longer absolute. She had taken her place beside him, not as a mere pawn, but as a force in her own right. The Duke's eyes softened just slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. Evelyn could feel the shift in the air around them, the subtle change that signified a new understanding between them. She was no longer the woman who had been chosen. She was the woman who had chosen herself. She could see the flicker of something in the Duke's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the shift that had taken place. It was a rare moment of vulnerability in a man who had built his world on the foundation of power and control. But in that moment, Evelyn knew something he had not yet fully realized. The true power lay not in the ability to control, but in the ability to choose. To make your own way, to carve your own path. And she had done that. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, but Evelyn was no longer the woman she had been. She had taken her place beside him, and with that, the power had shifted. The tension in the air was palpable, but it no longer suffocated her. She was standing in her own strength now, her own power. The Duke's lips parted as if to speak, but then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His hand reached up to touch her cheek, his fingers brushing lightly against her skin, a soft, almost imperceptible touch that sent a wave of heat rushing through her. His touch was not possessive. It was not the touch of a man who sought to control. It was the touch of a man who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, as their eyes met. She could see it in his eyes now,